As the Roman Empire declined and collapsed, so did its art. With the radical simplification of its society, so came the radical simplification of its art. Sculpture, painting, and pottery declined along with every other aspect of Roman artistic endeavor. Is this collapse led into the Dark Ages? H.B. Lovecraft commented upon the lifespan of civilizations in his novella At the Mountains of Madness. The Elder Things, an alien race which colonized Earth millions of years ago, went through rises and falls until they finally went extinct in a final collapse just before the rise of humanity. The archaeologist who discovered the remains of the Elder Things observed their history as it was recorded in a series of bas reliefs. These archaeologists took special note as the bas reliefs became more and more crude in their art as time went on and the civilization crumbled. H.P. Lovecraft has gone on to be arguably the greatest influence upon modern horror fiction. If he were alive today, he would note that the descendants of his artistic influence have grown crude and disfigured, just as the bas reliefs of the Elder Things. Many observe that Lovecraft is ground zero for SJW rage, that his influence must be mocked, understated, and ultimately forgotten, that his works must be replaced by works which agree with the party line, his icons smashed in waves of moused ecstasy. It seems that if one is to even mention his name, then that mention must be followed by hatred and loathing for Lovecraft, because he was immutably right wing. Well, let's start with the basics first. Horror is the most reactionary genre of fiction. It is also one of the oldest genres. The dawn of the horror novel was in the 18th century, and that was the dawn of the Gothic novel and the genesis of the horror genre. In Gothic fiction, the past is horrific. This past represented by the obscurantism of Christianity and especially Catholicism, and the tradition and folklore over and against the modern world built by the Enlightenment. In Gothic fiction, the empiricist material world is but a facade, and the real world is the sublime, mysterious world of the supernatural which lies underneath. This can be seen in figures such as the vampire Dracula or the satanic monk Ambrosio. Sometimes these monstrosities lying underneath are not legendary but new, and the newness is something uncanny, a strange and distressing familiar aspect of oneself or society revealed through the magic or technology. Such is the case of the summoning of Pan and the great god Pan or Frankenstein's monster. Thus, the uncanny often acts as a reminder for the need of humility in the face of God or nature's God. Another common trope is the return of the repressed, where past actions or repressed desires locked away or forgotten come to impact and disrupt the life of the protagonist. This can be seen in the lesbianism of Carmilla or the repressed sexual desires of the id of Mr. Hyde. While the horror genre in the 20th and 21st centuries would expand outward from what would become the Gothic horror subgenre, these three tropes, the reality of the supernatural, the need for humility in front of God and nature's God, and the return of the repressed, are seen in nearly every aspect of horror and in every subgenre. Something which is much more central to horror is the fear of the other. At the base of all horror fiction lies the fear of the other, and this is something which can never be removed from the genre, no matter how much our society favors the virtue of inclusion. While the regime will demand the most horrific of real-world people, the insanely violent member of ISIS, the serial killer, or even the pedophile must be reintroduced in society as fully viable members. Even the most deconstructed and humanized of the others of horror must still be seen as an other for this horror to be viable. horror is known for exploring transgressive subject matter. Incest, homosexuality, rape, and even necrophilia are often been explored within horror fiction for centuries. The reactionary nature at the very base of the genre often focuses to be reactionary regardless of the political views of the author. Mary and Percy Shelley were the most cutting edge of the left wing in their time, yet Frankenstein is extremely reactionary. Man attempts to play God and is humbled by the monstrosity of his own creation. Just as the threat of the other forms the very core of the genre, the distinction between good and evil is a core which can never be revoked. What generates horror is always seen as intrinsically wrong, not just on a conscious level, but upon a primal level. The actions and views which invoke horror must be seen to be wrong in order for that genre to succeed. Something which is salient is that much of horror relies upon disgust, and this is seen in the form of gore or body horror. These tropes, gore or body horror, invoke the negative feeling of disgust. Disgust is an inherently reactionary emotion which creates an other. The transgressive bio-Leninism that seeks to find the most repulsive and degenerate of minorities and give them power over you can never find peace with the horror genre. The most repulsive and degenerate of minorities, such as homosexuals, transgendered, or the extremely fat, who were made vanguards of the revolution under the bio-Leninist model, invoke a deep sense of disgust. The objection to transgenderism, homosexuality, and miscegenation does not lie upon rationality or well-founded arguments for the majority of the people, even though there are great arguments to be made upon these. But it lies upon the naked reality of disgust, which is intrinsic to most good and normal people. The emotion of disgust puts horror as subversive in its very nature to the new regime. Lovecraft came into the horror genre at a very important time and provided the bridge work for its diversification from the initial Gothic and the various subgenres which exist today. He is widely respected for its influence upon the creation of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is a subgenre which centers upon humanity as being small and weak compared to strange and outerworldly forces which dominate and control this universe. The reality, though, is that he was just as important in the creation of the body horror genre as he was to the cosmic horror genre. The reason that people often forget this is that this was overshadowed, with body horror ultimately laying as but a symptom of man's smallness in the universe, and that Lovecraft really lacked this modern mind-body distinction in his work. The mind and body are one and the same in Lovecraft's work. And again, that's very right-wing too. Because Lovecraft focuses on physiognomy often and describes the demented and insane as being physically mutated or disfigured by their insanity. Insanity, which is a very common trope in his work, is also mirrored by body horror. When you go insane in Lovecraft's world, your body is defigured. But one of the real reasons, and this is far and above his influence, that Lovecraft is still around, is that he simply is cool. While Robert Chambers, Arthur Machen, and William Hope Hodgson have prefigured Lovecraft's innovations, none of them are anywhere close to being immortalized in the same way which Lovecraft has been immortalized. For one, Lovecraft as a man is deeply interesting. The neat wallowing away in poverty and unknown in his lifetime, but being recognized in his death as a genius, is a very, very romantic thing which people latch on to. People love that type of underdog story. His monsters are bizarre and interesting. Nothing is so utterly recognizable as the weirdness of Cthulhu. All his beasts, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, the Deep Ones, the Old Ones, are all immensely unique and instantly recognizable. Something which is also captivating about Lovecraft is the lore of forbidden knowledge. The deepest realities and the most revealing secrets of the universe in Lovecraft are hidden away from the waking world. Learning that ultimate reality of the universe will drive the true seeker insane. Unlike Gothic horror, where the hidden supernatural horrors were legendary or part of folklore, here they are utterly strange and unknown. Man ultimately knows nothing about the universe in which he lives, and learning about it will only lead to his own destruction. Lovecraft's world is a world in which a series of mysteries has no bottom or logic to it. One widely used trope within Lovecraft's writing is the unreliable narrator. His work is often told in first person and from the perspective of someone who has lost his sanity from being exposed to these mind-bending horrors of forbidden knowledge. These characters are often not very fleshed out, and this has commonly been seen as a weakness by his detractors, but in reality this is one of his greatest strengths, because the first-person narration without the characterization makes the reader the character. The reader is then confronted with their overwhelming lack of sanity up close and personal, and conflates the character with their own emotions. To top it all off, the canon and continuity which is shared between these stories, but in a very loose and slapdash fashion, which allows the fan to decipher and make his own understanding of the universe, which Lovecraft created to his own heart's content. Not only did Lovecraft spur this on, but he actively encouraged fan fiction throughout his own lifespan, allowing fans to make his world their own in the form of the widely proliferated mythos fiction. Because of his stature and his influence and the enduring quality of his work and the ever-growing cult that he attracts, Lovecraft is an intractable figure which the modern leftist has to confront if they are to work in the horror genre. Thus, to them, Lovecraft becomes a forbidden fruit who tantalizes the SJW mind and their ilk. They have to confront Lovecraft in some form if they are to work or even comment upon the horror genre. Many want to brush Lovecraft's reactionary and far-right views under the rug. His biographers will often claim that he abandoned these views, but I don't think that holds that much water, because they're the most clear in his later work, and even more so than in his earlier work. I have not read his correspondence, so maybe I'm wrong here, but it appears that he abandoned social Darwinism, and that is his so-called move away from the right. But he never abandoned racialism, or Nordicism, or his Spenglerian view of history. And the reality is that his views regarding race and civilization are tied to the very core of his corpus. To Lovecraft, being mixed race was the ultimate form of body horror. The mixed race are the most often people liable to fall under the influence of the dark forces of the universe. Arthur Germain commits suicide about learning of his heritage, a heritage which acts as a clear allegory for having a mixed race heritage. This cannot be skirted because one of Lovecraft's most famous and enduring works is The Shadow over Innsmouth, a transparent allegory for immigration, where the native culture of New England is eroded by immigrating fish people who miscegenate with the local inhabitants. The town is then transformed into a horrible monstrosity which has nothing to do with its New England roots. Another overarching theme is a Spenglerian view of the rise and decline of civilizations. As I talked about earlier regarding At the Mountains of Madness, the fate of the Elder Things is directly stated in text to parallel the decline of the Roman Empire. But here's another thing. The rise of the slave Slogoths and the extinction of the Elder Things who created them can be seen as to parallel the Haitian Revolution. In another one of Lovecraft's great works, The Shadow Out of Time, This follows the rise and decline of a great civilization and includes the extinction of the human race as well as its rise and decline. Often another author is presented as an alternative or even PC alternative to Thomas Ligotti. Ligotti has a very nihilistic view of the universe. To him, life is suffering, and the only advocacy which is worth pushing forward is a militant antinatalism. This may be a horrific view of the universe, but to me it is different and weaker than the fullness of Lovecraft's cosmic horror. What makes Lovecraft different from regular nihilism is that nihilism is focused upon the individual and his lack of meaning that he finds in the world. Cosmicism, on the other hand, sees man as irrelevant to the force of the galaxy, not just as an individual, but ultimately as a civilization and a species. The threat of human extinction is examined through the extinction and annihilation of civilizations, something Lovecraft feared greatly in accordance to his own civilization, the Anglo-Saxon founders of the United States, and through his Anglophilia, the British Empire and the influence of the Anglophones as a whole. The idea of pure antinatalism is far more abstract than the idea of societal annihilation. It's much more threatening and personable to think about your own family and your friends and all the values that you hold going extinct than the mere contemplation of life being suffering intrinsically, or that creating children is evil because it perpetuates the suffering. Now, Lovecraft, to be honest, isn't the perfect writer. His work is often inert and sometimes used obscure purple language. But to many of his fans, these flaws are endearing. The purpleness of his prose, which is often so lambasted by his critics, is beloved by his fans. Eldritch is an adjective which has become synonymous both with Lovecraft himself and cosmic horror in general. The lacking descriptions of the earlier work are often parodied with the utmost love by his fandom. One of the main strategies of those who want to obscure or downplay Lovecraft's legacy is to say that he has horrible prose. The reality is that his prose isn't any more obtuse than many of the classic works of Gothic fiction that came before him, and then often again they will champion writers such as Ligotti or even Ramsey Campbell, who are just as obtuse. Now, personally, this is what I've just heard. I've not read Campbell's work yet, but from my understanding, he is quite purple, and a lot of people find him difficult to read. Now, I have read Ligotti. I haven't read his whole corpus, but I've read a lot of his short stories, and I will tell you, Ligotti is just as purple as Lovecraft, but his work is far more difficult to read for Lovecraft's, and for a different and more meaningful reason. Ligotti is an adamant postmodernist who often uses unconventional narratives in his short stories. These unconventional narratives are often very difficult to decipher, and they can make his work extremely difficult to read for a casual reader, and they are much more elitist in nature than simply using 17th and 18th century adjectives for flavoring as Lovecraft does in his work. The reality of the situation is that Lovecraft is a snag upon the horror genre for the SJWs and the cult of wokeness. He's a figure of such stature and influence that he cannot be readily ignored. The reformers of our culture are faced with two options. One, they can transform the characters of Lovecraft and keep the themes intact, or they have to transform the themes in order to serve the regime as a whole. If the supporters of the regime are to address Lovecraft via the replacement of his characters with diversity, they will become snagged upon Lovecraft. They know that Lovecraft would not approve of this, so they will respond by having as much stuff that Lovecraft would disapprove of in their work as possible, to essentially force Lovecraft to spin in his grave with anger. With Marvel, we'll take a counterexample. You can just make characters like Spider-Man or Captain America black, or just take a superhero, make them gay or lesbian. The opposition there to, say, turning Mary Jane black, who was born a redhead, is simply Mary Jane was a redhead. It doesn't really have anything to do with her character. She was just born a redhead, right? And with, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, they were moderate liberals in their time. But the problem with doing this with Lovecraft is it's a direct assault upon him and his legacy. Lovecraft characters are who they are because there is a purpose which drives the philosophical world view that Lovecraft is bringing to life in his plot and fiction. Lovecraft was far right within his own time, and he is far right within the time of today. So those who adapt Lovecraft's work or receive influence upon it, who are of the woke mindset, purposely speak of their disdain towards Lovecraft because they have to. Because Lovecraft cannot be separated from his far right ideas personally and his far right themes that he inserts in his work. So they must purposely insert things that he would not approve of in an act of hatred, for one thing, against Lovecraft, who is evil. Because the ultimate evil of this regime is the heresy of things like racism and homophobia, but also to show their fidelity to the regime, that they do not agree with Lovecraft, that they agree with the regime, and that Lovecraft's legacy, even if they respect an aspect of it, must ultimately tarnished if they are to show fidelity to the regime and love in agreement with it. I think one of the most salient aspects of replacing Lovecraft's characters or changing his character's race or inserting, non-traditional things within Lovecraft, you'll often see this in movies, is miscegenation is a non-threatening plot element. So, a lot of times, this miscegenation is a black man and a white woman, right? The one that's going to generate the most opposition, and, certain lizard people have a deeply seated fetishization of this, right? And this can be seen in multiple films, multiple adaptions of Lovecraft. Some of these are highly beloved, right? And I will say all three of these movies are great. But From Beyond has it, H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon has it, and The Color Out of Space has it. And another thing you'll often see is that, mythos writers will include Lovecraft as a character within their own fiction. And, it's because Lovecraft is such a fascinating person, people love to do this. But in modern woke works, a common motif which turns this on its head is turning Lovecraft's descendant as a non-white, right? Lovecraft had children who miscegenated, right? And now he has non-white offspring who succeed them. Finally, we have the transferal of the horror aspect into racism, sexism, or homophobia. And you'll see this in TV shows such as Lovecraft Country or Carnival Row, where the horror described as segregation, or the 2007 Cthulhu film, where the horror is homophobia. And a thing with these works is that they begin to break down the framework of horror fiction. They surrender the very basic outlines of the horror genre to be made into thinly veiled political statements. This is where the second option comes to play. Replace the horror genre itself entirely. And the most grievous defender and proponent of this is HBomber guy, who has a pretty infamous video on YouTube which outlines it. Outsiders, How to Adapt H.P. Lovecraft in the 21st Century. The themes of Lovecraft in specific and horror in general are too reactionary. They are things which society must progress beyond, as he personally grew beyond them when he accepted his own bisexuality. The themes of the threat of the outsider and the distinction between good and evil and the resulting disgust towards evil are too embedded within the horror genre, so the horror genre must be destroyed. He thinks the best way forward is seen in a film, The Shape of Water. The Shape of Water, though, is not a horror film. It's a magical realist film, where the outsider is not a threat to be feared, but something to be fetishized and slept with. The Shape of Water, again, is transparently political, and it features miscegenation with a fish person, the ultimate horror of Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, as an empowering act of rebellion against the repressive society of the pre-civil rights movement in the United States. In HBomber's eyes, the horror genre is something which can be progressed beyond and replaced. Replacing Lovecraft's characters, or including miscegenation of homosexuals, is not enough. And that's the ultimate conclusion of the Wokening and SJW advocacy. To replace the existing culture with one which is in agreement with their worldview. Some genres, such as superheroes, can be accommodating to that worldview. The villains can become transparent symbols of the opponents of the regime. So in Spider-Man, the Kingpin can become an analog for Trump. The principal characters can maintain their costumes, but they can be replaced by diversity underneath. So you can have a black Spider-Man, a black Captain America, an Asian Hulk, a Pakistani Miss Marvel, and so on. In some cases, though, entire genres must be erased and forgotten. The Western is too tied up with masculinity, too tied up with America's white identity, and too embedded with the historical realities which have now been rewritten in the new regime. The horror genre, then, in my eyes, is just like the Western genre, and it has to be replaced in the regime of wokeness. Starting with Lovecraft and working downward. Lovecraft's view of civilization is too culturally relative, and the slasher genre is too puritanical. The gothic and occult horror is too rooted in Christian tradition. Body horror requires the reactionary emotion of disgust to be effective, so on and so forth. So, we return to the decline of culture and art, of which Lovecraft spoke of when he described the declining civilization of the Elder Things. Now it is his works which have been turned into hollow husks for the popular masses. Yet the reality is that Lovecraft remains a prophet of the Anglo-American decline and the horror which lies beyond in the collapse of the United States and the culture of the West at large. Lovecraft today is more relevant than ever, and his genius will remain relevant until the end of days.